I was still in my dress uniform when I realized my family wasn't coming. The ceremony had already started. Rows of chairs filled with parents, spouses, children, people leaning forward, phones, ready eyes bright with pride. And next to me, an empty seat. I stepped outside, the sound of applause muffled behind the heavy doors, and called my father. He picked up on the third ring. Laughter spilled through the phone before he even spoke. "Hey," he said casually, "what's up?" I could hear music, voices, the sharp crackle of something grilling. "I just wanted to check," I said. "Are you close?" A pause. Then, "We already ate." Another voice in the background, "My sister's." "Tell her we saved her a plate." My father chuckled. "We're at your sister's place. Just a small BBQ." I didn't say anything. Then my mother's voice, closer now, almost impatient. "Don't make this a big deal, Hannah." I stood there in uniform medal ceremony starting without me inside and realized they hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. The first thing you notice about a military ceremony isn't the speeches. It's the stillness. Even with a room full of people, there's a kind of quiet that settles in before anything begins. Chairs shift, programs fold and unfold. Someone coughs, then catches themselves like they've broken a rule. Everything feels measured, intentional. I had always liked that. It was different from home. At home, everything was louder, not in volume, but in presence. Conversations overlapped. Attention moved quickly like it had somewhere better to be. There was always something else happening, something more interesting pulling focus away. But here on base, in rooms like this, when something mattered, people stopped. They paid attention. That's what I had expected today. Not applause, not anything dramatic, just attention. I had pressed my dress blues the night before with the kind of care that came from habit more than nerves. Every crease sharp, every ribbon aligned. I checked it twice, then once more in the morning, because that's what you do. You prepare. Not for recognition. For respect. The invitation had gone out a week earlier. I didn't make it sound bigger than it was. "Hey, I'm being recognized at a formal Air Force ceremony next Friday. Families are invited. I'd really like it if you could come." I reread that message before sending it. It was simple, clear, no pressure. Rachel replied first. "Is this like one of those admin things?" Then a second message. "We have something planned that day, but we'll see." My father responded hours later. "What exactly are you being recognized for?" I stared at that question longer than I should have. Not because I didn't have an answer, I had many. But I knew none of them would land. I typed back anyway. "It's an achievement medal for work this past quarter." There was no response after that. My mother reacted with a heart. That was it. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that if they came, it would be because they chose to, not because I convinced them. I told myself I was okay with either outcome. That was the part I almost believed. Inside the hall, the ceremony moved forward without hesitation. It always does. Names were called. People stood, walked to the stage, shook hands, received their recognition. Applause followed, steady, respectful, never excessive. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about acknowledgement. When my name was announced, I stood automatically. Training takes over in moments like that. You don't think about where your hands are or how you walk. Your body knows, your mind follows. I walked up to the stage, accepted the medal, and nodded to the commander as he pinned it in place. His words were brief. "Well earned." That was all. But in his tone there was something my father had never quite managed. Certainty. I turned, faced the room, and for a moment my eyes drifted across the rows of people. Families. Smiles. Phones raised to capture the moment. And then, that empty chair. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't hit me all at once. It was quieter than that. Like noticing a missing step in a staircase you've walked your whole life. You don't fall. You just pause. After the ceremony, people gathered in small clusters. Congratulations were exchanged. Conversations overlapped in a low hum of shared relief and pride. Someone laughed nearby. A child tugged on their father's sleeve, asking questions about the uniform. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do with my hands. My supervisor approached first. "Good work today," she said. "Thank you." She glanced around briefly. "Your family couldn't make it." "No," I replied. "They had something else." She nodded once. No follow-up, no pity. Just acceptance. That was something I appreciated about this place. People didn't dig into what you didn't offer. They trusted you to say what mattered. And I had already said enough. I left before the room fully emptied. The parking lot was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rows of cars. I walked slowly, the sound of my shoes against the pavement sharp in the stillness. When I reached my car, I didn't get in right away. I stood there, keys in hand, staring at nothing in particular. Then I pulled out my phone. I don't know why I called. Maybe habit. Maybe hope. Maybe some part of me still believed that if I heard their voices, there would be an explanation that made everything feel less intentional. The call connected on the third ring. Laughter. That was the first thing I heard. Not a greeting, not my name. Just laughter. The kind that comes from being surrounded by people who already understand you. "Hey," my father said, "what's up?" And in that moment, standing alone in a parking lot in full uniform metal still pinned to my chest, I understood something I had spent years trying not to see clearly. It wasn't that they didn't know what this meant. It was that it didn't mean enough. After the call ended, I sat in my car for a long time. The engine off, the air still. I didn't cry. That part surprises people when I tell this story. They expect something louder, more visible. But the truth is, when something happens enough times, it stops feeling like a shock. It becomes a pattern. And patterns don't break you all at once. They shape you slowly. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. For a moment I thought about calling back. Explaining. Telling them what the ceremony actually was. What the medal represented. How many layers of approval it had gone through. How many people had signed off on it before it reached me. I imagined the conversation. The pause on the other end. The slight shift in tone. Oh, we didn't realize. But even in that imagined version, something felt off. Because the truth was, I had told them. Not in detail. Not in a way that fit neatly into their understanding. But I had told them. And they had chosen something else. I opened my eyes and looked down at the medal. It caught the light just slightly enough to remind me it was there. Real. Solid. Undeniable. I reached up and touched it briefly, then let my hand fall back to my lap. I didn't need to explain it. Not anymore. As I drove home, the sun dipped lower, casting everything in a softer light. By the time I reached my apartment, the day had already begun to settle into memory. I hung my uniform, carefully smoothing the fabric one last time before stepping back. In the mirror, I caught my reflection. Older than I remembered. Calmer than I felt. And for the first time that day, something inside me shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to notice. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt in the way I expected to be. I was clear. Clear about what had happened. Clear about what it meant. And clear about what I wasn't going to do next. Because for years I had tried to translate my life into something my family could understand. Something simpler, smaller, easier to accept. But standing there in that quiet apartment with the echo of that phone call still lingering in my mind, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. I was done explaining. And this time, I wasn't going to say anything at all. In my family, nothing was ever said directly. There were no loud arguments, no slammed doors, no dramatic ultimatums that forced everything into the open. If something was wrong, it didn't explode, it settled. It lived in small pauses, in the way conversations shifted just slightly when you spoke, in the way people responded to you like they were already halfway turned toward something else. That was how I learned where I stood. Not from one moment. From all of them. The backyard came first. Every house has a place where things happen. For us, it wasn't the living room or the kitchen. It was the backyard, wide, uneven grass, a long wooden table that my father built himself, and a grill that seemed to be in constant use from early spring through late fall. That table held everything. Birthdays, celebrations, announcements, even small victories somehow made their way there, turned into something communal, something visible. It was where Rachel belonged. My sister had always been easy to celebrate. She spoke in a way that made people lean in. She laughed loudly, moved, confidently filled space without hesitation. When she walked into a room, attention followed her naturally, like it had been waiting. And my parents, especially my father, understood her. Her successes were simple to explain. She just landed a new client. She's expanding her business. She's doing really well. Those sentences didn't require translation. They didn't need context. They made sense immediately. They sounded like progress. I was different. Not quieter in a fragile way, not withdrawn, just less visible. I didn't know how to turn what I did into something people could grasp quickly. Even as a kid, when I tried to explain something I'd worked hard on, it came out too detailed, too layered. By the time I reached the point, I could already feel attention slipping. So I learned to shorten things, then to simplify them, and eventually to stop explaining altogether. When I was 12, I won a regional academic competition. It wasn't a big event, just a school gym, folding chairs, a handful of parents scattered across the bleachers. But to me it mattered. I had studied for weeks, late nights at the kitchen table, notes spread out in careful stacks. When they handed me the certificate, I held it like something fragile. Important. At home, I showed it to my father while he stood near the grill turning burgers with one hand. He glanced at it, nodded once. "Good job," he said. Then he went back to what he was doing. Later that evening, I saw the certificate resting on the edge of the backyard table. Not displayed, not mentioned again. Just there until the wind picked up and flipped it over. Rachel had come home that same day talking about a small event she'd hosted with friends. Nothing formal, just something she organized. But the way she told it, animated, detailed, made it feel bigger than anything I'd done. My father listened. Really listened. He asked questions. He laughed at the right moments. He leaned in. That was the difference. Not what we did. How it was received. By high school, the roles were clear. Rachel was the one people asked about. I was the one people assumed was fine. "She's easy," my mother would say. "She doesn't need much." I knew she meant it as a compliment. But I also knew what it meant in practice. Less attention. Less effort. Less curiosity. The first time I mentioned the military, we were sitting at that same backyard table. It was late afternoon, the sun low enough to soften everything. My father had just finished grilling. Plates were passed around, conversation moving easily between topics that didn't require much thought. "I've been looking into the Air Force," I said. The sentence landed quietly. My father didn't react right away. He took a bite of his food, chewed, then looked at me. "Why?" he asked. "I want something structured," I said. "Something that matters." Rachel let out a small laugh. "That's what people say when they don't know what else to do." My mother frowned slightly. "Isn't that dangerous?" My father leaned back in his chair. "It's not a real career," he said. "It's something people do before they figure things out." I remember nodding. Not because I agreed. Because I had already decided. Basic training was the first place I felt understood. Not in a warm, emotional way. No one there was trying to understand you as a person. That wasn't the point. But the expectations were clear. You either met them or you didn't. There was no guessing, no reading between lines, no wondering if what you did mattered. If you did your job well, it was recognized. If you didn't, it was corrected. Simple. Fair. I didn't need to explain myself. I just needed to show up. When I sent a photo home after graduation, me in uniform, standing straight, everything aligned, the response was predictable. My mother said I looked so grown up. Rachel commented on the uniform. "Looks serious," she wrote, followed by a laughing emoji. My father asked one question. "So what's the plan after this?" After this. As if it were temporary. Over the years, that pattern never really changed. When I visited home, my father introduced me the same way every time. "This is my daughter Hannah. She's in the Air Force. Does support work." Support. It was the word he used when he didn't understand something. Or didn't value it enough to try. Rachel would nod along, smiling slightly like she was confirming something already obvious. I stopped correcting them early on. Explaining didn't help. It just made the gap more visible. The backyard table stayed the same. Even as we got older, it remained the center of everything. Rachel's milestones were still celebrated there. Promotions, new business ventures, social events that blurred the line between personal and professional success. People gathered, drinks were poured, stories were told. And my father, always at the head of the table, spoke about her with a kind of pride that filled the space. I would sit there sometimes, listening, nodding when appropriate. Present. But not part of it. When I did share something about my work, the conversation shifted quickly. Not abruptly, just subtly. So you're still doing that. Do you ever think about transitioning out? Is there growth in that field? Questions that sounded reasonable, until you realized they were all pointing in the same direction. Away. That's what made the invitation to my ceremony different. Not because I expected them to understand it, but because I thought just once they might choose to show up anyway. Not for the details. For me. Looking back, I can see now that the choice had already been made long before that day. It wasn't about one event. It was about years of small decisions. What to pay attention to. What to celebrate. What to let pass quietly. And when I stood in that parking lot, phone still warm in my hand after that call, hearing laughter music, the easy comfort of a gathering that didn't include me, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like confirmation. The backyard table had always had room. Just not for everything I was. That was the pattern. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to fit into it anymore. By the time I made staff sergeant, I had stopped announcing milestones. Not because they didn't matter, but because every time I tried to explain them, the explanation collapsed somewhere between my words and their expectations. Rank meant something specific in my world, earned, measured, layered with responsibility. In theirs, it was either obvious or it wasn't. And if it wasn't obvious, it didn't count. So I learned to let things happen quietly. My job didn't look impressive from the outside. That was the first problem. There were no dramatic images to go with it. No stories that translated easily into something you could repeat over a backyard table. No clear before and after moments that made people pause and say, "Oh, I get it now." What I did lived in the middle of things. Coordination, information flow, timelines that had to line up precisely or everything downstream would fail. I worked between teams, between decisions, between moments that most people only noticed when something went wrong. If things ran smoothly, no one asked why. If they didn't, everyone did. I liked that. Not the pressure exactly, but the clarity. There's a certain kind of trust that comes from being the person people call when they need something handled correctly the first time. It doesn't come with recognition, it comes with expectation. Can you take this? I need you to look at this. Make sure this doesn't slip. The first time my supervisor handed me something that mattered, she didn't make a speech about it. She just placed the folder in front of me and said, "Run point." That was it. No explanation of why, no list of what it meant. Just trust. I didn't rush. That was the difference. In situations where timelines tightened and information overlapped in ways that didn't make sense at first glance, most people sped up. They tried to move faster than the problem. I slowed down. I read everything twice. I asked the right questions. I traced details back to where they started instead of where they ended up. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. Over time, people noticed. Not in a way that drew attention to me, but in the way responsibilities shifted quietly in my direction. More tasks, more coordination, more situations where the margin for error was smaller. My name started appearing in places I wasn't present for. Meetings, recommendations, emails that moved up the chain. I didn't chase any of it. I didn't need to. The work spoke when I didn't. At home, nothing changed. When I came back on leave, the conversations followed the same patterns. So what exactly do you do again? Is that something you can build a future on? You ever think about transitioning into something more stable? Stable. It was a word my father used often. As if the military was temporary. As if the structure, the expectations, the responsibility, everything I had built my life around was just a phase I hadn't outgrown yet. I would nod, answer briefly, then let the conversation move on. There was no point in pushing. Understanding wasn't something you could force. The award package started like everything else. Quietly. My supervisor submitted it without making a big deal out of it. I didn't know the details at first, just that she had put something in after a particularly demanding quarter where our section had absorbed additional workload without missing deadlines. That kind of thing happens all the time. Packages move up, some stall, some come back with notes, a few disappear entirely. I didn't expect anything different. So when she called me into her office a few weeks later, I assumed it was about something else. "Close the door," she said. I did. She leaned back slightly, hands resting on the desk. They approved it. I waited. "You're receiving an Air Force Achievement Medal at the next ceremony. Her tone didn't change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly warm. It was factual. "You earned it," she added. That was all. I nodded. "Thank you." And then I went back to work. That part always surprises people when I tell it. They expect excitement, reaction, some visible shift. But recognition in the military doesn't stop the mission. There were still deadlines, still responsibilities, still things that needed to be done before the end of the day. So I sat back down at my desk and continued where I had left off. Later that night, alone in my apartment, the reality settled in. Not all at once. Gradually. I sat on the edge of my bed uniform hanging neatly nearby and thought about everything that had led to that moment. The long days. The small decisions. The times I stayed late to make sure something didn't fall apart the next morning. No one had seen those. No one at home, at least. And yet, here was an institution built entirely on structure and accountability, saying clearly, without hesitation, this mattered. That was the part I couldn't translate. Not into something simple. Not into something that would fit into a casual conversation over grilled food and half-listen to stories. Because the value of what I did wasn't in a single moment. It was in consistency. In showing up. In being the person people relied on when things were uncertain. When I invited my family, I didn't try to explain any of that. I didn't say meddle in a way that emphasized its importance. I didn't list the levels of approval it had gone through. I didn't describe what it meant in the language they understood. I just told them the truth. I'm being recognized at a formal ceremony. That was enough. Or at least it should have been. The night before the ceremony, I pressed my uniform again. Not because it needed it. Because I did. Preparation had become a ritual for me. A way to center myself. A way to remind myself that what I was about to step into deserved attention. Respect. I moved through each detail carefully. Ribbons aligned. Shoes polished. Insignia straight. When I was done, I hung it up and stepped back. For a moment, I just looked at it. Not as something to wear. As something that represented everything I had built without needing anyone else to validate it. That was the part they never saw. Not because it was hidden. Because they never looked. And standing there that night in the quiet of my apartment, I realized something that stayed with me the next day. And the day after that. And even now. I didn't need them to understand my work. I needed to understand it myself. Completely. Without translation. Without simplification. Without shrinking it into something easier to accept. Because once you see the full weight of what you've built, really see it, you stop asking other people to measure it for you. And that's what made what happened the next day different. Not the ceremony. Not the empty seat. Not even the phone call. But the fact that for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain any of it. I just let it be what it was. And let them miss it. The morning of the ceremony didn't feel important. That's the first thing people misunderstand. There was no sense of anticipation, no dramatic weight pressing down on the day like something irreversible was about to happen. It started the way most of my days did, quietly, with routine carrying me forward before I had time to think too much about it. Alarm. Coffee. Silence. I moved through each step automatically, shower, uniform laid out exactly where I had left it the night before. I checked everything again, not because I doubted it, but because precision had become a habit I trusted more than emotion. When you prepare the same way every time, you don't leave space for uncertainty. You just show up. On base, nothing changed. That was something I appreciated more than I realized. There were no decorations in the hallway. No reminders that this was a special day. People worked, phones rang, doors opened and closed with the same quiet efficiency they always had. A few people nodded when they saw me. Good luck tonight. Congrats. Nothing more. It wasn't dismissive. It was respect. Recognition didn't interrupt the mission. It existed alongside it. By late afternoon, I drove home. The light had shifted slightly, the kind of subtle change you only notice if you're paying attention. Everything looked softer, less defined. I changed in silence. The apartment felt smaller once I put the uniform on, like the space adjusted itself around it. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment, not to admire anything but to check. Everything aligned. Everything where it should be. For a second, I thought about sending a message. A simple one. Heading there now. But I didn't. I had already invited them. Anything else would have felt like a reminder. And I didn't want to remind them. I wanted them to choose. The hall was already filling when I arrived. Families clustered in small groups, voices low but warm. You could tell who belonged to who just by the way they stood slightly closer, slightly more engaged. There's a kind of pride that doesn't need to be announced. It shows in posture, in attention, in the way people look at you like they've been waiting for this moment with you. I noticed those things the way I always did, quietly. From the outside, I found my seat. Second row, center. There was a program on the chair beside me, folded neatly. I picked it up, glanced at it, then set it back down. The chair next to mine stayed empty. At first, I didn't think much of it. People run late. Traffic happens. Plans shift. I had seen it before. But as the room filled and the seats around me settled into place, that empty space became more defined. More noticeable. Not dramatic. Just there. The ceremony began. Opening remarks. A brief overview of the quarter. Names read in a steady, practiced cadence. The rhythm was familiar. Predictable. Comforting in a way. Because in a room like this, things happened the way they were supposed to. There was no guessing. No wondering if something would be acknowledged. If it mattered, it was recognized. When my name was called, I stood. Walked. Accepted the medal. The commander's handshake was firm, his expression steady. Well earned, he said. 2 words. But they carried weight. Not because of who he was, because of what it meant for him to say it. I turned to face the room. For a moment, my eyes moved across the crowd without intention. Faces, smiles, phones raised. And then, that empty chair. Still there. Still waiting. I sat down. Hands resting lightly in my lap. Back straight. Breathing even. If anyone noticed the absence, they didn't say anything. And I was grateful for that. Because attention in that moment would have made it something else. Something heavier. Something harder to carry. After the ceremony, people gathered. The energy shifted. Formal became informal. Conversation started. Laughter returned. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer than necessary, letting the moment settle before standing. My supervisor approached. Nice work, she said. Thank you. She glanced at the empty chair, then back at me. Family couldn't make it. No, I said. They had something else. She nodded once. All right. That was it. No questions. No sympathy. Just acceptance. I stepped outside. The air was cooler than I expected. The sky had started to shift toward evening, that soft transition where everything feels slightly suspended between day and night. I walked a few steps away from the entrance before stopping. My phone was already in my hand. I don't remember deciding to call. I just did. The ring felt longer than it probably was. 1, 2, 3. Then, a click. Laughter. It came through the speaker immediately, loud and unfiltered. Music in the background, voices layered over each other, the unmistakable sound of something casual, something easy, something full. Hey, my father said, what's up? I stood there looking out at the parking lot. I just wanted to check, I said, are you close? There was a pause. Not long. Just enough. Then, we already ate. A voice in the background, Rachel. Tell her we saved her a plate? My father laughed softly. We're at your sister's place, he said, just a small BBQ. I closed my eyes for a second. Not because I needed to. Because it gave me a moment. I see, I said. Behind him, someone asked a question. Glass clinked against glass. A burst of laughter followed, easy and uncontained. Then my mother's voice, closer now. Who is it? It's Hannah, my father replied. A shift. A slight change in tone. Hi, honey, my mother said. Everything okay? I opened my eyes. The building behind me, the uniform on my shoulders, the medal still pinned to my chest. Yes, I said, I just finished. Oh, she replied, that's good. A pause. Then, don't make this a big deal, Hannah. The words didn't land the way people expect. They didn't hit me like something sharp. They settled. Quietly. Like everything else had. Okay, I said. And I meant it. Not as agreement. not as acceptance of what they had done, but as a decision. We ended the call shortly after that. No argument. No raised voices. No attempt to explain. I stood there for a few seconds longer, the phone still in my hand. The sounds from inside the building drifted out through the doors, muted applause, distant conversation, the closing rhythm of something that had already happened. Behind me in a different place, another gathering continued. Laughter. Music. The kind of moment that didn't require explanation. And somewhere between those two spaces, I understood something clearly for the first time. It wasn't that they had forgotten. It wasn't that they didn't realize. It wasn't even that they didn't care in the way I once thought they might. It was simpler than that. They had chosen where they wanted to be. And it wasn't here. I got in my car, closed the door, sat there for a moment without starting the engine. The quiet inside the car was different from the quiet in the ceremony hall. Less structured. More personal. I looked down at the metal again. Still there. Still real. Still exactly what it had been a few minutes earlier. Nothing about it had changed. The only thing that had changed was what I was going to do next. I started the engine. And for the first time since the day began, I wasn't thinking about whether they would understand. I was thinking about what it meant that they didn't. I didn't call them back. That was the first decision. Not a dramatic one. Not something I announced to myself like a turning point. It was quieter than that, more like a door I chose not to open again. When I got home, I took off my uniform the same way I always did. Carefully. Jacket first, then the shirt. The medal came last. For a moment I held it in my hand. It was heavier than it looked. Not physically just enough to notice, but in a way that reminded me it wasn't symbolic. It wasn't decorative. It was the result of something real, something documented, something that had been seen and acknowledged by people who understood what it meant. I placed it on the table near the door. Not hidden. Not displayed. Just there. Then I moved on. The next morning felt ordinary. That was the second thing people misunderstand. They expect something to shift immediately after a moment like that. A change in posture, in tone, in the way the world responds to you. But the world doesn't work that way. Emails still come in. Meetings still happen. The same problems still need to be solved. I went to work. Logged in. Reviewed what had come in overnight. My supervisor passed by my desk and gave a small nod. Morning. Morning. That was it. No mention of the ceremony. No follow-up. Just continuity. And I found unexpectedly that I appreciated that more than anything else. Around mid-morning, the base public affairs office posted the video. They always did. A short caption, a link to the full recording, a few still images attached, no music, no edits, just a record. I saw the notification come through and dismissed it. I didn't open the video. I didn't share it. I didn't send it to anyone. That part mattered more than I realized at the time. Because for years I had done exactly that. Shared things. Explained them. Offered context so that the people in my life could understand what they were looking at. I had translated my life into something easier to consume. This time I didn't. The day moved on. Work filled the space where thoughts might have settled. Tasks, conversations, small decisions that added up to something functional, something complete. By the time I got home, the ceremony already felt like something that had happened a long time ago. Not forgotten. Just placed. The first message didn't come from my family. It came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A former classmate. Hey, just saw this. Is this you? There was a link. I recognized the thumbnail immediately. The stage. The flags. My name in small text at the bottom of the screen. I didn't reply right away. I just looked at it. Then I closed the message and set my phone down. More messages followed. Not many. Just enough to notice. People I hadn't expected. Proud of you. That's incredible. Didn't know you were doing this. Short. Simple. Direct. No one asked for an explanation. No one needed one. That was the difference. It happened slowly after that. Not in a way that felt like momentum. More like a quiet shift. Someone shared the video. Another person commented. A name was recognized. Connections formed in the background without my involvement. I didn't track it. I didn't engage with it. I let it move on its own. 2 days later, something small changed. A comment appeared under the video from someone with my last name. Not Rachel. A cousin. "Wait, is this Hannah from Dayton?" Another comment followed. "Isn't that your sister?" And then, Rachel was tagged. I didn't see it right away. I wasn't checking. That was the third decision. Not to watch. Not to monitor. Not to anticipate their reaction. Because for the first time, I wasn't preparing for it. I imagined the moment anyway. Not intentionally. Just because I knew them. Rachel at a table. Phone in hand. Conversation flowing around her until something caught her attention. A name. A face. A connection she hadn't expected to see in that context. My father leaning slightly closer. Reading. Watching. Trying to understand what he was looking at. My mother quiet. Taking it in without speaking. There would be a pause. That was the part I knew best. That space where everything shifted slightly, where the narrative they had been holding no longer aligned with what was in front of them. Not dramatically. Just enough to make it uncomfortable. I didn't need to be there to see it. I had spent years in those moments. I knew what they felt like. The difference was, this time I wasn't the one explaining. That was the part that changed everything. I didn't send the link. I didn't call. I didn't say, "Did you see it?" I didn't give them context. I didn't soften it. I didn't translate. I let them see it exactly as it was. Without preparation. Without framing. Without me standing next to it trying to make it easier to understand. That was what people would later call revenge. But it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel sharp. It didn't feel satisfying in the way people imagine. There was no moment of triumph. No sense of balance being restored. It felt quiet. Because what I had done was nothing. I hadn't exposed anything. I hadn't revealed anything. I hadn't created a situation for them to feel something they hadn't chosen. I had simply stepped back and let the truth exist on its own. That was all. A few days passed before my phone rang again. This time it was Rachel. I watched it light up on the table. Her name. Clear. Unavoidable. I didn't answer. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. But because for once, I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't respond first. If I didn't fill the silence. If I let it stay. Because silence, I had learned, wasn't empty. It was space. And for the first time in my life, I was finally comfortable letting it exist. The first message didn't say I'm sorry. It didn't say congratulations either. It came from my mother late in the afternoon while I was sitting at my desk halfway through a report I had already read twice. "Why didn't you tell us it was like that?" I stared at the screen for a few seconds before I understood what she meant. Not the words. The tone. Confusion edged with something else. Discomfort. I didn't open the video. I didn't need to. I already knew what they had seen. The stage. The flags. The formality. The kind of recognition that didn't fit into the category they had placed me in all these years. I typed back slowly. "I told you what it was. I read the message once, then sent it. No explanation. No elaboration." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Reappeared. "You said it was a ceremony," she replied. "We didn't realize it was that serious." That serious. I leaned back in my chair, eyes moving away from the screen for a moment. There it was again. The same question phrased differently. "Why didn't you make it easier for us to understand?" My phone buzzed again before I could respond. This time it was my father. Not a call. A text. Someone tagged Rachel under that video. I didn't reply right away. Another message followed. People were asking questions. I could picture it clearly. The backyard. The same table. Different tone. Rachel checking her phone. My father reading over her shoulder. The shift in conversation as something unfamiliar entered a space that had always been predictable. "We looked foolish," he added. That was the first time the word "we" had been used. "Not you. Not your situation. We..." I stared at the message, not because it surprised me. Because it didn't. It fit. Perfectly. The issue wasn't what they had missed. It was how it made them look. I typed carefully. I didn't do anything to make you look anyway. Then I added, I invited you. The response didn't come immediately. When it did, it wasn't from him. It was my mother again. You could have explained better. I let out a slow breath. Not frustration. Not anger. Just recognition. That was the pattern. Always had been. If something didn't make sense, it wasn't because they hadn't asked. It was because I hadn't explained it in the right way. I didn't reply. For the rest of the day, my phone stayed quiet. No calls. No follow-ups. No attempt to push further. And for the first time, that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The next few days passed without much change. Work continued. Tasks moved forward. The same steady rhythm that had carried me through everything else held firm. Then almost 2 weeks later, my mother called. It was mid-morning. Unusual. She usually texted first. I let it ring once. Twice. Then answered. Hi, I said. Her voice sounded different. Careful. Measured. I just wanted to check in, she said. I'm okay, I replied. I know, she said quickly. I just wanted to see how things are going. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. How's work, she asked. It's busy, I said, same as usual. Another pause. Then, your father watched the video again. I didn't respond right away. He didn't say much, she added. I'm not surprised, I said. She hesitated. He sent the link to your uncle, she continued. Didn't say anything, just sent it. I closed my eyes briefly. That was how my father communicated. Not through words. Through evidence. Okay, I said. We sat in that conversation for a few moments longer. Small questions. Simple answers. Nothing heavy. Nothing resolved. But something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no apology. No admission of being wrong. But there was awareness. And for people like my parents, that was significant. Over the next few weeks, the contact stayed minimal. But different. My mother started asking questions she had never asked before. Not about outcomes. About process. How long are your days? Do you get enough rest? Do you like what you're doing? The questions came slowly, like she was learning a new language. My father sent 2 messages during that time. Both brief. Both indirect. Saw something about the Air Force on the news today. Thought of you. No names. No emotion. But no dismissal either. That was the difference. Rachel stayed silent. At first I expected something. A message. A comment. Some attempt to reframe what had happened in a way that brought things back into balance. Nothing came. Weeks passed. Then a month. And I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't miss her voice. Not the way I thought I might. For most of my life, Rachel had been the reference point. The comparison. The louder presence that defined the space I occupied. Without her, the space felt clearer, less crowded. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with understanding. I had spent years adjusting myself around her, around my family, around what they valued, what they noticed, what they chose to see. And now, for the first time, I wasn't. Not because they had changed completely, but because I had stopped needing them to. That was the part no one could see in the video. The part that mattered most. They had finally seen me, without my help. And I had finally stopped waiting. For them to. There's a kind of quiet that comes after something shifts. Not the heavy kind, not the kind that presses in on you and asks to be filled. A steadier kind. The kind that stays. The weeks after that call settled into something new. Not better. Not worse. Just clearer. My mother called more often. Not every day, not even every week at first, but enough that I noticed the change. The conversations were different. Shorter. Simpler. She didn't try to redirect anything, didn't suggest alternatives, didn't ask when I planned to do something else. Instead, she asked questions she had never asked before. How was your day? Are you sleeping okay? Do you have time to eat properly? They weren't big questions, but they were new. And for someone like my mother knew mattered. My father didn't call. That wasn't unusual. But the way he reached out changed. Every few days a message would appear. A link. An article. A short sentence. Air Force unit helping with disaster relief. No commentary. No explanation. Just the link. The first time it happened, I stared at it for a while. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. That was his version of acknowledgement. He wasn't going to say I was wrong. He wasn't going to say I didn't understand what you do. But he wasn't dismissing it anymore. And for him, that was as close as it got. I didn't reply with anything long. Just, yeah, that kind of work matters. A few minutes later, he sent a thumbs up. That was enough. Rachel never reached out. At first, I expected it. Not because I needed it. Because it was what I had always known. She would come back into the conversation somehow. Recenter herself. Shift things back to where they had always been. But she didn't. Time passed. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into something that no longer felt like waiting. And slowly something settled into place. I wasn't anticipating her reaction anymore. I wasn't preparing for it. I wasn't leaving space for it. Because I realized something that surprised me more than anything else in this entire situation. I didn't need it. Not her explanation. Not her perspective. Not her acknowledgement. For most of my life I had measured myself against her without meaning to. Against what she represented. What my family understood. What they celebrated easily. And without that comparison, I felt steady. Not better. Not superior. Just grounded. At work nothing changed. And everything did. I moved through my days the same way I always had. Careful. Focused. Consistent. But something underneath it all had shifted. I wasn't carrying the same question anymore. I wasn't wondering if what I did would ever be enough for the people who mattered most. Because I had already seen the answer. And I had stopped needing it to be different. One afternoon, my supervisor caught up with me in the hallway. "How are things?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "They're different," I said. She nodded like she understood more than I had explained. "They usually are," she replied. That stayed with me longer than I expected. Because she was right. Things don't change all at once. They adjust. Slowly. Unevenly. In ways that don't always look like progress. But are. A few weeks later, I visited home. It wasn't planned far in advance. Just a short trip. A weekend. The backyard looked the same. The table still in place. The grill still where it had always been. My father stood near it, turning something over with the same steady motion I had seen my entire life. He glanced up when I walked in. Gave a small nod. Hey. Hey. That was it. No mention of the ceremony. No reference to the video. Just presence. My mother came out a few seconds later. Smiled. Hugged me briefly. Hi, honey. We sat at the table. Conversation moved the way it always had. Light. Neutral. But there was something missing. Not tension. Expectation. No one asked me to explain anything. No one minimized anything either. It just existed. At one point, my father pulled out his phone. Scrolled for a second. Then turned the screen toward me. An article. Air Force operations. Logistics. Coordination. He tapped the screen once. This part, he said. Seems important. I looked at it. Then at him. Yeah, I said. It is. He nodded. Put the phone away. And just like that, the conversation moved on. No apology. No resolution. But something had been acknowledged. In his way. Later that night, I stood alone for a moment near the edge of the yard. The same space where I had spent years feeling like I was slightly outside of everything happening around me. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Not because the space had changed. Because I thought about the ceremony. The empty chair. The phone call. And everything that had followed. If someone had asked me back then what I would do next, what my revenge would be, I don't think I would have had an answer. Because what happened didn't feel like revenge. It felt like clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand anything. I didn't force them to see me. I just stopped explaining. And when I did, they had to see me anyway. Not the version they were comfortable with. The real one. And once something like that is seen, it can't be unseen. If you've ever found yourself in a place like this, where the people closest to you don't fully understand what you do or why it matters, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to make it smaller for them. You don't have to translate it into something easier to accept. And you don't have to wait for their approval to know its value. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Just stand where you are. Let your work speak. And allow the truth to exist without explanation. If this story felt familiar to you in any way, if you've ever been overlooked, misunderstood, or quietly set aside, I'd really like to hear your experience. Where are you watching from? What part of this stayed with you? We share stories like this every day. Stories about family identity and the moments that quietly change everything. So if you want more, consider subscribing. And let's keep going together.